I remember that night, my son Ethan's graduation. The family gathered in the restaurant, the lights dimmed, smiles beaming. Then my mother stood up, her voice cold. "We're taking Ethan's college fund and giving it to Jason." My heart sank. Ethan, who had sweated through summers, was pale. My husband Mark laughed. "That's fun because we're transferring him." My parents screamed, red-faced with rage. That night was supposed to be fun, but it shattered like a wine glass dropped on the floor. I could still hear the clatter of knives and forks in the restaurant that night, but then everything went quiet. My mother stood up, her eyes sharp, her voice flat as she read the verdict. "Jason needs the college fund more than Ethan. He's struggling. Ethan will be fine." I felt the floor tilt, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan, my son, sat there, his hands clenched under the table, his eyes shining, not with joy but with pain. He'd worked so hard, night shifts at the coffee shop, late-night study groups, only to hear that from his grandmother. My father nodded, slowly, as if he were dispensing some great wisdom. "It's what's best for the family," he said, his voice deep and confident. "Family?" I wanted to scream. What kind of family would trample on one child's dreams to prop up another? Jason, my nephew, was a household name in trouble stories. Dropping out of school, getting into fights, being pulled out of trouble by my grandparents over and over again. My Ethan, meanwhile, never asked for more money than he earned. I glanced at Mark, my husband, waiting for a sign. He just sat there, beer in hand, his eyes strangely calm. Then he laughed, a short, sharp laugh, like a knife cutting through the stuffy air. "That's funny," he said, his voice soft but enough to freeze the table, "because we transferred that fund last month." The world stopped spinning. My mother blinked, her mouth opening but no words came out. My father slammed his fist down on the table, his face red. "What?" he roared, the sound echoing above the whispers at the next table. I didn't have time to react. Mark leaned forward, his smile still on his face, but his eyes were steely. "We knew you were going to do something stupid," he said, "so we took the money out of your hands." That was when the real storm hit. My mother stood up, pointed a finger at me and hissed, "You have no right. That's family money." I laughed, but it wasn't out of joy. It was a laugh of anger that had built up over the years. "Family," I repeated, my voice shaking. "What family are you talking about? The family that abandoned Ethan to save Jason over and over again?" Ethan looked up at me, his eyes begging for an explanation that I didn't have. I turned to my mother, each word coming out like a knife. "Ethan is my son. He deserves every penny in that fund." "What about Jason? Another bailout for his mistakes?" My father interrupted, his voice cold. "Jason needs a chance to start over. You're so selfish." I choked. Selfish? After all I've endured, after all the sleepless nights worrying about Ethan, they dare call me selfish? Mark put his hand on my shoulder, steady as a rock. "We're done," he said, his voice low but firm. I looked at my parents, who had been my rock, now reduced to shadows. They were screaming, but I couldn't hear them anymore. All I saw was Ethan, the son I swore to protect, no matter the cost. I stood in the kitchen, shaking as I held the phone, when Mark walked in, his face as white as a ghost. "They tried to take the money," he said, his voice hoarse. I looked up, my heart sinking. "Who?" But I knew the answer before he said it. "My parents. They called the bank, pretending to be us, saying there was an emergency to withdraw Ethan's funds." I felt the blood drain from my face, and the spoon in my hand fell to the floor with a clang like a death knell. They didn't just want my son's money, they tried to steal it. I slumped back in my chair, my mind reeling. The bank had refused, they flagged it, thankfully, but that didn't ease the anger burning inside me. I thought back to that night at the restaurant, when my mother had so casually declared Jason more deserving than Ethan. I'd suspected it then, but it was clear now, they'd never intended for Ethan to keep the funds. It wasn't a gift to my son, as they'd promised. It was a card they could play when needed, a tool to rescue Jason from the ruin he'd created. I looked out the window, the afternoon light fading on the lawn. Ethan was at school, probably laughing with his friends, unaware that his grandparents had just stabbed his future. He had spent his entire childhood proving himself, studying hard, working at the grocery store, even refusing to go out to save every penny. Meanwhile, Jason? I remembered the time he crashed my brother's car, and my parents bought him a new one. I had been silent for so long, swallowing the injustice, but I couldn't anymore. That night, I called my father. He answered, his voice low as usual, but I didn't give him a chance to say anything. "How dare you?" I demanded, each word coming out like a bullet. "You tried to take Ethan's money, my son's money." There was a long pause, and then he sighed as if I was overreacting. "We just wanted to help Jason," he said. "I don't understand. He needs a chance." I laughed hoarsely, the sound catching in my throat. "A chance? What about Ethan? Doesn't he deserve a chance?" Mom cut in, her voice as sharp as a knife. "Ethan will be fine. He's smart. Jason's got nothing." I felt like I'd been slapped in the face. Smart? They thought that was a reason to take away my son's dreams? I screamed, unable to contain myself any longer. "You never cared about Ethan. From the time we were little, it was always Jason. Jason needed this. Jason needed that. What about my son? He's a shadow in your eyes." Silence. No apology, no remorse. I hung up, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. Mark came over and wrapped his arms around me from behind, saying nothing. But I knew he felt it too. The pain, the betrayal, the anger. I looked up the stairs, where Ethan usually sat doing his homework, and my heart broke. They hadn't just betrayed me, they'd betrayed him. And this time, I vowed I wouldn't let them win. Never. I stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the envelope I'd picked up from the porch, my heart pounding like it was going to burst. The return address was from an unfamiliar law firm, but I knew what was coming. Mark looked at me from the sofa, his eyes questioning, "What?" I ripped open the envelope, the words stabbing into my eyes. My parents were suing us. They wanted Ethan's college fund, based on a $2,000 contribution they'd made more than a decade ago, an old birthday gift they'd now turned into a weapon. I trembled, the paper falling to the floor. "They're not stopping, Mark. They want it all." Mark stood up, took my hand, and his voice was low but firm. "They can't win." But I wasn't so sure. My parents were masters of manipulation, sweet words, twisted stories, and now they were dragging us into court. I imagined Ethan walking in, his shoulders strained from a long day of school, hearing the news. He'd spent his youth building a dream, late nights studying, early mornings running to keep up his energy, only to have his grandparents snatch it away without hesitation. The trial came like a whirlwind. I sat there, looking across the aisle at my parents, my mother with a fake smile on her face, my father with his arms crossed in pride. Their lawyer stood up, his voice smooth. "My clients have contributed to the fund from the beginning. They have the right to decide." I wanted to scream, but Mark held my hand, whispering, "Calm down." Then they tossed out the receipt, a crumpled piece of paper from when Ethan was 7, $2,000, as if it were the key to his entire future. I looked at Ethan, sitting next to me, his eyes dark, no longer the light I had seen. Then he stood up, his voice shaking but firm. "I don't need your money." The room fell silent. I choked, pride mixed with pain. "I don't need you in my life anymore," he said, each word like a hammer hitting the air. My father curled his lips. "Don't be stupid, Ethan." But Ethan didn't waver. He turned to me, his eyes saying clearly, "Mom, we're done." I stood up, tears threatening to fall, but I held on. "Did you hear him?" I said, my voice low and sharp. "He's my son, and you have no right to him." My mother sneered, "You're being dramatic." But I saw the truth in her eyes. They knew they'd lost, not the money, but us. I turned to Mark, who nodded, without a word. We held Ethan's hand and walked out of the courtroom, our boots clicking on the wooden floor like a final declaration. Outside, the wind was cold, but I felt relieved. I looked at Ethan, who was pursed lips trying to hide his pain. "I'm sorry," I whispered, holding him close. He shook his head. "It's not my fault." But I knew I'd let my parents go too far for too long. As we got into the car, I glanced back at the building one last time. They could keep that $2,000, keep their lies. We didn't need it anymore. From now on, my family was Ethan, Mark, and me. No one else. I woke with a start, the sound of shattering glass from downstairs like a punch to the chest. The night was dark, save for a faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Mark was up, clutching the baseball bat by the bed, his eyes sharp. "Call 911, he whispered and dashed for the door. I reached for the phone, my heart pounding, but then I heard Ethan yell, "Mom! Dad!" from the stairs. I froze. No, it couldn't be him. I rushed into the hallway where Ethan stood, his face white, and downstairs Jason's lurching figure, holding the iron bar. Give me the money! Jason roared, his voice drunk, his eyes bloodshot. I felt the blood turn to ice. My parents had sent him. I knew it. They'd lost the case, Ethan's funds, and now they were using Jason as their last pawn. Mark stepped forward, the bat raised but didn't strike. He slammed it into the wall, bang, the wood cracked. Jason flinched, the iron bar falling to the floor, his wild gaze turning to panic. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking but firm. Get out of here. It's not yours. Jason chuckled. They said it was mine, and bolted for the door, running into the darkness. The police arrived shortly after, handcuffing Jason for breaking and entering. But the next morning, my mother called, her voice screeching down the phone. You overreacted. Why did they let them take him? I choked out. Overreacted? I growled. He came into my house with an iron bar. She paused, then muttered, You'll regret it. I hung up, my hands shaking, but my mind filled with one thought. I had to stop this. I remembered the old papers Mark had kept, my parents' tax records from a small rental apartment. They had always boasted of being decent businessmen, but I knew they had been hiding their income, evading taxes for years. I dug through the papers in the garage, flipping through them, my heart burning. That's right, thousands of dollars unreported. I called my mother, my voice icy. I know about your taxes. Stop, or the IRS will find out. She stammered. How dare you? I laughed. Try me. 2 days later, the IRS called. The investigation into my house had been abruptly dropped. Ethan's funds were released. I sat at the kitchen table, watching Mark and Ethan eat breakfast, the air still heavy. Mark put his hand on my shoulder. We won, but I wasn't sure. Jason had been arrested, then released. My parents had paid bail as usual. They hadn't given up, just backed off. Ethan pushed the plate of pancakes away, his eyes older than his years. I'm fine, Mom. I just want to forget them. I held him, tears falling silently. His strength, stepping up to face Jason, his voice unwavering, was a fire I'd never seen before. He was the symbol of this family, not money or lies. Looking out the window, I saw the old oak tree in the yard, standing strong through storms. We had stood strong through this storm too. But I knew, deep down, that my parents hadn't let go. They would come back somehow. I squeezed Ethan's hand, whispering to myself, they can't touch us anymore. Never. I walked into my parents' house for the last time, the air heavy as before a storm. My brother had called this meeting, saying things had gone too far. I didn't want to go, but Mark convinced me, maybe they'll tell the truth. I sat down across from my mother, her eyes sharp and unrepentant. Jason was there, gaunt, his eyes lost as if he'd just woken up from a dream. My father spoke, his voice low, we need to make peace. But I knew, that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted me to apologize, to give in. Then Jason spoke, his voice hoarse. You said the fund was mine, you promised. I turned to my mother, my heart pounding. She paled, stammering. We just wanted to help. I laughed dryly. Help? By tricking him? Tricking Ethan? The stark truth filled the room. Jason stood, trembling. I believe you. He looked at me, eyes red. I'm sorry. Then he left, his steps heavy as if carrying the pain. I stood up, my voice low but firm. I'm done. We're done. Mom yelled, you're tearing the family apart. But I didn't turn around. I drove home, lighter in my heart, but stinging in my eyes. Ethan went to college that month. His face lit up as he shouldered his backpack as he left the house. Jason, I heard, got a job at a store, enrolled in community college. Maybe he was finding himself again. And my parents? They were quiet, but I knew they weren't giving up. Late at night, I sat by the window, looking at the stars. Cutting them off, hurt like losing a part of my body, but I chose Ethan, chose the future. The pain was still there, but I could breathe. And that was enough. Thanks for watching my story. It means the world to me. If it moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's keep the conversation going. Comment below. See you in the next one.